welcome to a brand new episode of Beyond the Indus. I'm your host, Tushar Shetty. So last month, I happened to come across an interview of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the Lex Friedman podcast. And I do encourage all of you to go and listen to that interview because it's interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, through the magic of AI, the interview has been dubbed into English. So for those who don't understand Hindi, you can actually go and listen to Modi in his own voice talking about India's most important domestic and foreign policy issues. And there's one section which I found particularly interesting, in which he discusses the relationship between India and China. Now, despite ongoing border and trade tensions, Modi's remarks on China were noticeably different from, say, the tone he adopts when he talks about Pakistan, for instance. Rather, he describes the China-India relationship as one between two ancient civilizations, characterized largely by positive interactions and mutual learning, and that the current disputes were merely a small blip in a centuries-old shared history that needed to be resolved through dialogue. Now, Beijing responded to that quite positively, with Foreign Minister Wang Yi calling on New Delhi and Beijing to, quote, work together and take the lead in opposing hegemonism and power politics, stating that, quote, making the dragon and elephant dance is the only right choice. The dragon-elephant dance. It's a much more subtle affair than the chest thumping and the saber rattling and the unreasonable tariff slapping that the US-China relationship entails. It's a story of cooperation, conflict, as well as competition for prestige and influence across the global south. And nowhere is this struggle more apparent than in India's own backyard of South Asia. And that is the focus of this episode, to break down China and India's battle for influence and power projection in South Asia. We'll be diving into both countries' global ambitions and their strategic interests in South Asia, the various political, economic, and diplomatic tools they use to garner influence and goodwill in the region, and how their mutual relationship will evolve over the next few years as they both seek to ascend to superpower status in the 21st century. We'll be speaking later to Dr. Jagannath Panda to discuss India's South Asia doctrine, but first we'll be speaking to China expert Yun Sun to help us understand this issue from the Chinese perspective. Stay tuned. So today we're joined by Yun Sun. Yun is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries. With master's degrees from both the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing and George Washington University in the US, as well as from her prior roles in the International Crisis Group and as a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, Yun has extensive experience in China's foreign policy towards the global south. And I think she might be one of the best people to talk to understand China's foreign policy approach and ambitions in South Asia, but also to understand what's Beijing's mind in terms of what its broader ambitions are towards South Asia and its role within the world. So, Yun, with that, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a true pleasure.
Great. So, Yun, just to begin with, could you outline how China's foreign policy and power projection has evolved under Xi Jinping's leadership, and in particular, its approach towards the quote-unquote global south? And on a broader level, I guess, as China has risen to become a global power, what changes does it seek in the existing global order? And what role does it envision for itself in that new order?
Those are very profound and also insightful questions that will lay the groundwork for what we're trying to discuss or deliberate today in terms of China's policy towards South Asia. Generally speaking, we know that Xi Jinping's vision for his presidency or for his leadership and what should happen to China under his leadership is that the term used in Chinese is a rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And I think most people would agree what it essentially means is that unbeautiful place in the world. And what does it mean? What is China's rightful place? If you think about the name China, the literal Chinese English translation is the Middle Kingdom, right? It's the center of the universe. It is a hegemon. It is a sole superpower, at least in the region that China has existed for thousands of years. So I think by rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, it does imply a desire for China to restore China's status as a middle kingdom, as a superpower, and also as a hegemon. Here, people do make the distinction between China's regional ambition and its global ambition. I think most China analysts would point out that at the moment, China's regional ambition is different from its global ambition. I think in terms of Asia, especially East Asia, I think the desire is very clear that there should be a Sino-centric or China-centric regional security architecture, a regional order where China play a determining or dominant role. But I don't necessarily see that China seeks that status or seeks that role in a global scale just yet, because China as a global power, many would say it is not a complete. Its economic engagement has reached far and beyond globally, but its security capability, especially its military diplomacy, is still quite limited. Here, I think the distinction lies between, yes, in Asia, we have heard China talking about Asia is China, Asia is Asians' Asia, and Asian affairs should be managed by the Asians. So that is a very clear message that external powers that's not innate or not endogenous to the Asia region. And here, I think the very clear implication is pointing towards the United States. That external powers such as the United States does not have an intrinsic role to play in the region. So I don't think China tries to project that message globally, especially in Western Hemisphere. I don't think that China has a desire to become the superpower, to supersede the United States or to replace the United States as the sole superpower in the Western Hemisphere at all. So in terms of the revision of the global order, I think the Chinese argument is that the global order has never been static. It's always evolving. It's a dynamic process. What it will eventually evolve to, I think people would agree that we are in a process of fragmentation of the post-Cold War or post-World War II international order. What is it really evolving to, depending on what you see as a defining feature of the post-Cold War global order? Some would say that it's U.S. hegemony, U.S. as a sole superpower. But the process of multipolarization in the post-Cold War world has begun a number of years ago. I think the Chinese have stated publicly they would like to see the multipolarity in global affairs. They would like to see global South playing a bigger role in global governance and also have a bigger voice on international affairs. And I think in that process, China naturally sees itself as the largest member of global South, playing a leadership role or playing the role to manage or to organize its coalition among global South countries vis-a-vis global North. Is that going to be successful? I think that remains to be seen, because a lot of global South countries do not necessarily see China as a member of their bloc. They would argue that while the world is morphing towards a bipolarity between U.S. and China, remember great power competition, that's a bipolar great power competition. So in that process, the global South and you could even argue the countries like European countries are the third party in a bipolar world, that they are forming a largely neutral or balancing bloc, pursuing balancing diplomacy between United States and China.
Right. And you mentioned that China's, let's say, global strategy or international strategy and its regional strategy might be distinct and might be different things to analyze. And, unlike East Asia or even Central Asia for that matter, the Indian subcontinent has not traditionally been within China's sphere of influence. So, could you first talk about China's current South Asia strategy and how this region features in its wider global ambitions? And maybe talk about what sort of policy tools and diplomatic efforts is it utilizing to expand its influence in the region? And also, what are its long term strategic goals for the region? Does China view South Asia as part of its future sphere of influence?
I'm not sure that's how China sees the region or sees the sub-regions necessarily. And here is why. You ask about China's goal in South Asia. Well, traditionally, South Asia has never been China's primary theater, right? China's primary theater, meaning that China's primary target in terms of its security goals or security priority, has always remained in the region to the east coast of China. So that's West Pacific. And in the West Pacific, from north to south, there are at least four security flashpoints issues that could endanger China's national security. And from north to south, these four issues are North Korea, East China Sea, Taiwan, and South China Sea. So when China thinks about the national security, South Asia is to the west of China's homeland. So South Asia is seen as a secondary theater, not a primary theater. And when the conflict or the competition with the United States is primarily focused in East Asia or in the West Pacific, China's natural instinct for South Asia, which is seen as literally its backyard, is to keep stability in South Asia, to minimize the cost or minimize the resources China has to spend in the region. So China can primarily pinpoint all its focus, all its resources to the West Pacific. And that's the logic of China's national security strategy when comparing its primary theater in the East Asia and its secondary theater in South Asia. So in that sense, I don't see China has ever placed the top prioritization or top priority in terms of its sphere of influence or its dominance or its ambition in South Asia. But under Xi Jinping, one thing has slightly changed. It doesn't change the security prioritization or the sequence of the China's national security priorities. West Pacific, for as long as the U.S. is still seen as the most important and most significant national security threat to China, and for as long as Taiwan remains independent, I don't see China will ever shift its primary attention from West Pacific to South Asia. But under Xi Jinping, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative, what we're seeing is essentially China using a geoeconomic strategy rather than a geostrategic or military strategy to advance China's presence and China's influence across the different subregions in Asia. And I think under that framework, South Asia has come as a primary or one of the primary regions for China's geoeconomic expansion. And this can be attested to the vigorous push for economic cooperation, for the acceptance of Chinese financing, the push for infrastructure projects, connectivity projects that China has spent a vast amount of resources in countries in South Asia, including Pakistan, including Sri Lanka. We saw a lot in Nepal, and we're seeing increasingly more in Bangladesh. So what that essentially means is that I think for China, there is a recognition within the Chinese South Asia policy community that India is the largest country in the South Asian subcontinent. And India naturally plays a dominant role by default in the South Asia subregion. But I think what we're increasingly seeing and more clearly is that China does not accept the exclusivity of India's presence and India's influence in South Asia. So what that essentially means is that, well, South Asia subregion does have a largest power, which is India, but it doesn't mean that China cannot come to South Asia. It doesn't mean that China does not have does not have the right or the ability to develop its own influence and its own presence in the South Asia region. It means that India does not have the, well, at least in the Chinese view, India does not have the legitimate cause to deny China the presence in South Asia, especially considering how China's role or China's presence to counterbalance India's dominance is a pretty popular demand from smaller countries in South Asia. I think the Chinese do see a legitimate, justified cause for them to be there.
Right, absolutely. And even though South Asia traditionally, I mean, it's might be a secondary theater, one thing that can't be denied is that China's one of its vulnerabilities, shall we say, is its maritime sea routes, its trading routes. China being an export-led economy, its need to secure its export lanes are obviously a big priority. And South Asia's position in the Indian Ocean region, shall we say, is something that I think China does keep in mind. So, we're seeing China, you mentioned Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and we're also seeing China invest substantial amounts in ports in and around the Indian Ocean region. We also heard about the Maldives extending a hand to China for investments in that island region. So, could you discuss China's maritime strategy as it pertains to its activities and interest in the Indian Ocean region? How is China increasing its influence in the region? And is it facing any pushback from any quarters?
Well, the most pushback we're seeing is from India, right? India has not embraced China's Belt and Road Initiative. The amount of Chinese investment in India is still limited, and we see very regularly national security concerns about China's economic presence in India. So I would say that most of the pushback has come from India, but in other smaller countries there are also problems. What you said just now about South Asia being almost an indispensable link for China's Belt and Road Initiative, I'm trying to think that through which South Asian countries China has been able to successfully develop connectivity projects that eventually goes to Europe. At least on land, I don't see that. What China has done, for example, in Nepal, that's mostly infrastructure projects that connects Nepal to China. And in terms of China and Bangladesh, it's also difficult because Bangladesh borders Myanmar. There's not a direct border between China and Bangladesh. So how does China build connectivity projects through Bangladesh? I think that's also going to be a challenge. So a lot of attention, yes, has been focused on the Indian Ocean, on the maritime domain. Um, and traditionally, of course, it's because 60% of China's crude oil imports still comes from Middle East and North Africa, and they do travel through the Indian Ocean to back to China. Um, and I think that's where China's geoeconomic efforts have played the most important role. China's effort to, for example, build port facilities, many of them would call, a lot of observers would call these ports dual-use ports, that they're built as commercial ports, but they also have potential military utility. There are also other connectivity projects that Chinese have been keen on building, and also deepening the economic relationship between the countries in the Indian Ocean, region, with China, to link China more deeply to the future of the region. So I see this as primarily a geoeconomic expansion, with economic instrument or economic statecrafts as a primary ways to charter this course. Long-term strategic goals, I think the Chinese first would like to ensure the security of their transportation, of their shipment, whether that is oil shipment or it is a shipment of commodity. I think that's always coming as a primary goal for China in the region. Um, and secondly, I would say that as China prepares for its escalation of competition with the United States in West Pacific, I think they are more likely to see South Asia as a region that needs stability. and they need to minimize the resources and the cost and the attention and the policy capital that they need to spend in terms of South Asia. The maritime, if you talk about the maritime military strategy, I think something that people always talk about is Malacca dilemma and how China's shipment of oil and trade is vulnerable in the Indian Ocean to potential, for example, maritime blockade, naval blockade by the United States and its allies. I don't see China having developed a successful strategy to counter that probability just yet, but I think China has worked vigorously to decrease its dependence on foreign oil and also decrease its dependence on the critical vulnerability in terms of shipments through the Indian Ocean.
Right. And you mentioned the escalation of, say, the competition between China and the US. And as we record this, the world is still reeling from the shock of President Trump's unprecedented tariff announcement on April the 2nd, 10% for most of its trading partners, and a casual 125% on China specifically, which China responded to by slapping a similar tariff rate on US exports. As we stand on the precipice of a trade war, how would you evaluate China's response to the Trump administration? And what might it portend for the US China great power rivalry on the global stage? Does Beijing's assertive stance indicate its willingness to challenge the US economic hegemony? And to what extent will Beijing be able to fill America's shoes in terms of its centrality and importance to the world economy? And I don't just mean in the short to medium term. I'm thinking in the long term. Will it be able to be what America is to the world right now, let's say in 50 years or so?
Well, I don't think we have an answer to that question. Where does China sees itself in 50 years? Does China really seek to replace the United States, or China in one way or another is more keen on displacing the United States from the world stage? Um, there are characteristics of the American economy and the centrality of the American economy to the global economy that I don't think China will be able to replace at all. I think the two economies have been developed on very different backgrounds and also on very different trajectory. So even if that the United States is no longer the sole superpower, I still do not see, for example, RMB being the transaction currency, given how the Chinese central government still controls the exchange rate. Which means that if the Chinese currency is not going to replace US dollars as the world transaction currency, then there is a very large piece of the world economy that America currently occupies that China cannot replace. Um, in terms of the current trade war, I just got back from China. My understanding is that the Chinese do want to talk, but they don't feel that talking is their only option, meaning that they don't feel that they cannot put up a fight. I think there is a higher level of confidence in China that compared to 8 years ago, China is better prepared for a trade war. And thank you for mentioning the 125%. I think White House clarified it to be 145% tariff on all Chinese products exported to the United States. Well, I think we all know that after 60 to 70% tariff, the trade is already killed. It no longer makes economic sense for China to try to export to the U.S. market. So whether it's 100% or 125% or 145%, it's just a number. It no longer has the marginal effect of increasing the ability or increasing the reduction of the Chinese export to the United States. So trade is already effectively killed by the tariff, and I think that the same is also true for U.S. export to China. So I think the Chinese response is that they do not seek to be the first mover. They don't see themselves as seeking the first mover advantage, and they would rather to be in a reactive or responsive position to respond to the U.S. U.S. imposition of tariffs. And the second point is that when they respond, they will retaliate. That if they, well, we have seen that when they perceive that Washington is targeting or attacking China, they will respond in kind. And I don't think that is going to stop. So now we're in a stalemate, right? Both sides have imposed this much tariff against each other. Where do we go from here? I think that's a question not about China, but that's more of a question about Trump administration's policy. That is Trump really seeking a deal, or he is just seeking decoupling? Because if Trump's goal is to bring manufacturing industry back to the United States, honestly, he cannot give leniency in terms of the tariff treatment. Because once you lower the tariff, then you cannot really bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States. So if negotiation is in the cards, I think at this point it will be quite difficult to return to negotiation table, especially because, remember, both leaders have very strong personality. Neither leader would like to be seen as a loser or as seen as the first one to make a concession. So how do we get out of that deadlock, or that is almost a roadblock to the next step of a negotiation? I think that's the essential question. And the worst case scenario that the tariffs will remain, we are watching literally the decoupling of the two economies. And if the escalation continues, it could also spill over to other domains that's not entirely economic.
Moving on to, let's say, China-India relations. In a recent interview, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, expressed his desire to increase dialogue and cooperation with China to resolve differences, terming it not just mutually beneficial, but also necessary for global stability. So with this in mind, I have a two-part question. And the first one is, how does the Chinese establishment view India in terms of its role as an emerging global power? Does it see it as a potential threat or a rival? Is it a partner to potentially cooperate with? Or is India just not taken seriously in China's own ambitions, at least when it comes to South Asia or the global South, shall we say? So what role does India play in China's strategic matrix?
Well, I don't think it's either or. I think it's like, does India see China only as a threat or also potentially a partner to cooperate with? I think it's both, right? For great powers or for big powers like China and India, the definition of each other is not going to be black or white. There are always going to be things that they do not see eye to eye with each other on. And there are always going to be things that they can potentially expect a cooperation on. So I would object to the idea of a dichotomy that is binary analysis, that is either good or bad, is either friend or enemy. In reality, is usually 50 shades of gray. So I would say same for China. China sees India, well, not as a potential threat for as long as India does not seek coalition or alliances with the United States, because that's what China sees as threat. But in terms of India, essentially the question is, how do you manage the relationship with a neighbor that is a big country, right? So I think for the lessons that China have learned, to seek cooperation and also maintain, on one hand, you do have differences. So maintain those differences, but also at the same time, seek cooperation is always going to be less costly than seeking a confrontational and aggressive or provocative status. I think another example of this approach is China's relationship with Russia. That China has reiterated it, but stated again and again that China cannot have a hostile relationship with Russia. And if you think about that statement, I think it reflects more fear rather than admiration or affinity. I think it reflects a deeply scarred past in terms of China's relationship with Russia historically. So coming back to China and India and the context in global South, Um, I think the question is, how do you frame this relationship? Do you frame it as China coming into India's traditional sphere of influence, trying to compete with India for its regional dominance, or frame it as actually there are things that China and India can work together on, both as members of a global South? And if you think about the parameter or the angle from a global South framing, then one could argue that China and India also have a lot of common interest in terms of um, projecting the voices and the views of the global South vis-a-vis the global North. So I think at different times, the relationship has prioritized different things. I would say that between 2020 to 2024, I think the Chinese have prioritized the border issue or the adherence to China's principal position in Ladakh. But I think since October of 2024, I think the Chinese are prioritizing seeking a different priority, which is to seek cooperation with India um, and put the border disputes in a secondary place.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that was the second part of that question, right? Because we're seeing a lot of havoc unleashed by, shall we say, radical shifts in US economic and foreign policy. So, do you think that might lead, or is there like scope or evidence for a potential thawing in China India relations? Because, when you're following India's foreign policy and statements from Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, there seems to be almost a sense of betrayal that comes with a lot of the talk on China, but it's not necessarily the language you hear about, say, countries like Pakistan, for instance. It's a lot more conciliatory. It's a lot more, let's say, long-term oriented. So, and I follow Ambassador Xu on Twitter, the Chinese ambassador to India, New Delhi, and he does seem to be making substantive outreach to try and engineer a detente. So, in terms of, is it a signal from Beijing that it intends to have a new approach towards this relationship with India? And where do you see China-India relations heading over the next few years of, let's say, this presidency, and perhaps beyond that as well?
Well, I feel that we've been here before, right? If you think about 2017, we had the Stockholm standoff. Then turning things around in 2018, I'm recalling the meeting that President Xi and Modi had in Wuhan at the Eastern Lake, and how romantic or bromantic that was. So I feel that we've been here before. I feel that in 2018 there was a very significant effort from China to engineer a detente or engineer a elevation of China-India relationship to a almost unprecedented historical level. But then we also know that very quickly fell apart in 2020 with the clash in Ladakh, followed by basically 4 years of the relationship being frozen. So I would say that none of these is permanent, right? And the key question for me, or the more interesting question for me, is what drives the changes? Why would China be nice to India in 2018 and then again in 2024? But why was China willing to stage or to endure deterioration of relationship with India between 2020 and 2024? So what are the essential factors that's driving the different attitude? And if you ask me, I think the essential factor here is the United States.
Hmm.
I think in 2018, there was a genuine concern in China about the U.S. desire under the first Trump administration to build a cozy relationship with India, to enhance defense cooperation, to elevate India to the status of a regional hegemon in order to counterbalance China. And remember, back then, the statement was in the great power competition, helping for the U.S. to help India is already helping U.S. itself, right? So I think in 2018, the Chinese did identify that there was a tendency for India to seek a coalition with the United States, and this could represent a much bigger threat to China's national security, not only in South Asia but also in East Asia. I think in 2024, I think the Chinese identified the same concern again, considering the popularity, the vast popularity that candidate Trump enjoyed during the election campaign. I think it was very plausible that the Chinese were thinking ahead about a second Trump term and what would that mean for U.S.-India relationship and what would that mean for China-India relationship. So I think in preparation for that deterioration of China's external environment, Beijing made a strategic decision to improve its relationship with India. So is that going to be sustainable? Well, we'll have to see. It also depends on how malleable India's strategic choices are. Because I think one factor that drove the Chinese calculation was India's neutrality or India's autonomy on the issue of Russia in the context of Ukraine war. India was able to demonstrate to the United States that we're like-minded countries, but it doesn't mean that India is going to follow the United States on every single issue. India still has its distinct national interests that's not always aligned with how U.S. perceives India's policy should look like. So I think that image of India's strategic autonomy also sent a signal to China that it is possible for China to influence India's strategic option or strategic choices. And I think the convergence of the need to prevent the emergence of an India-US coalition, and the conviction that it is indeed possible for China or it is indeed possible for India to charter a different policy course from the U.S. policy on China. I think those factors contributed to the Chinese decision to improve relationship with India.
Right. And that's very interesting theory that, it does matter who the president of the United States is in terms of influencing the relation. So I suppose that portends very well for India-China relations for the next 2 years or so. And I suppose the best thing for India-China relations would be a third Trump presidency, although whether or not the world might survive that is a separate question. But I'm being facetious. Yun, that was very interesting. And thanks so much for those insights.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
So joining us today is Dr. Jagannath Panda. Dr. Panda is the head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs and executive editor at the Institute for Security and Development Policy in Stockholm, Sweden. As a senior expert on China, East Asia, and Indo-Pacific affairs, Dr. Panda's current research focuses on India's relations with major Indo-Pacific powers, including China, Japan, South Korea, and the EU. His extensive qualifications and accolades as a global expert in the field of international relations and strategic studies are frankly too numerous to list here in detail. But just to give you a sample, he holds senior positions in 3 major research foundations for strategic studies around the world. He's published 7 books and several peer-reviewed journal articles on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific, and has even testified to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission at the U.S. Congress on China and South Asia. So frankly, I cannot fathom a better person to speak to on India and China's strategic competition in South Asia. So Dr. Panda, welcome to Beyond the Indus, and thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure to be speaking to you and to the diplomat.
Fantastic. So Dr. Panda, to begin with, could you start by giving us an understanding of what India's South Asia doctrine is in terms of its goals, its priorities, and strategic interests in the region? What is India's long-term vision for South Asia and the Indian Ocean region in general? And what sort of a role does it intend to play as regional hegemon?
I think it's a big question when it comes to South Asia in comparison to the other sub-regions of Asia. First of all, I think we have to go to the basics to ask whether there is something really called South Asia doctrine in Indian foreign policy or in India's strategic policy outlet. To my mind, I think South Asia as a concept in Indian foreign policy and strategic doctrine has seen a kind of decline in its curves and in its importance, because more and more India is rising as an economy, and more the geopolitics in the southern Asia or in the Indo-Pacific region are getting to the new level. India is trying to merge both the neighborhood with the extended neighbor. So, in that context, I think the focus on South Asia has shifted to be merging more with the broader Indo-Pacific region. Now, while saying that, I would say that we have to also understand the context of India's outlook on South Asia more in a broader canvas, particularly from the viewpoint of regional security doctrine. Now, does India really have a regional security doctrine? I think if we try to understand the way Delhi is looking at the foreign policy issues, the geostrategic, the geoeconomic canvas of the regions, there is definitely a regional security doctrine is emerging, and that is that India wants to see a India-centric Indo-Pacific context, and therefore South Asia figures as a natural and a vital component in India's Indo-Pacific, strategic canvas that India is trying to promote with an Indian identity. And in that context, I think there is a focus about peace and stability. You asked about goal, priorities, and strategic interest. To India, one of the most important strategic goal in the South Asia and in the extended neighborhood region is to uphold peace and stability. As you recall, that from the times of the Indian independence, India has been struggling to uphold peace in the western frontiers, particularly in the northern western frontier. That is particularly with its problematic ties with Pakistan and China. So peace and stability on the bordering regions in the northern to western frontiers of India's territory has been one of the focal point of India's South Asia as well as in today's broader Indo-Pacific context. Second is, I think what India is looking in the Indo-Pacific canvas today is how to really merge South Asia as a neighborhood with its extended neighborhood. That is what India is calling as India-centric Indo-Pacific region. Uh, in South Asia, there are a plenty of uh, strategic issues are there, particularly, as I mentioned, the boundary dispute with China, the problematic relationship with Pakistan, the problematic neighborhood discomfort with Bangladesh, with Nepal, and also not so cordial relations in recent past with Sri Lanka. So all of these are to India's priorities and strategic goals, that India wants to have a good management of relations with all of these countries. Of course, with Pakistan, India has not really been successfully managing its relationship post the independence. But if you see the other relationship, India has managed well, despite of a war with China in 1962, despite of ups and downs with China on many complex boundary issues, including on the Tibet and Dalai Lama issue. So therefore, management of relationship has been one of the priorities for India. And today, that management of relationship, India wants to also replicate in the broader Indo-Pacific context. Second is, I think, protects boundary regions, particularly the bordering points, be it land borders or maritime borders. As you know, some of the South Asian countries are not only immediate neighbors to India, but also they shares a closer proximity of land borders as well as maritime borders. For example, if we take the example of Bangladesh, if we take the example of Sri Lanka, they are both land borders as well as maritime border countries. Um, Sri Lanka particularly is a maritime bordering country, which is at the crux of Indo-Pacific regions, Indian Ocean regions, and therefore India wants to manage a good relations with all of these countries. The third point is that I think the way India wants to execute its leadership, a limited leadership vision in the immediate neighborhood context, but at the same time, try to show a leadership position where India's voice will be heard as a leader. Of course, with South Asia, South Asian countries, India's relationship is a little sensitive. As we know, with Pakistan, the relationship has been quite tense for many decades. With China, also, it's been a very delicate affair. But with other countries, even the relationship has been quite delicate, but still India has managed well in terms of its relationship with Bangladesh, relationship with Sri Lanka. There, India is silently excluding China, India is trying to show a leadership role, particularly in the context of Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, where the dependency on India should be visible. And this is where India is trying to make a case that during the pandemic, post the pandemic, India has been, assisting some of these countries not only in providing goods, aid and developmental programs, but also trying to also pitch to these countries in the times of crisis. And we have seen at the time of Sri Lankan crisis, economic crisis, India did pitch as a neighboring country, as a immediate country from South Asian regions, trying to help it economically. And today also, when Prime Minister Modi recently visited Sri Lanka, he met several leaders to talk about the economic recovery plan. So the limited leadership India is trying to exhibit to the regions is also built in the context of India-centric Indo-Pacific outlet that India is trying to portray itself in its foreign policy, and that is also not to ignore one big aspect in the South Asian context. South Asia has been a problematic region for India for many decades, but at the same time, what it has affected in to India's posture and image is it has affected India's identity as a major power in the regions, because since India has not been able to manage its relationship with the South Asian countries so effectively and not been able to maintain peace and stability, so therefore India's identity as a major security player has not really been seen positively. So therefore, ontological insecurity has been one of those big aspects of Indian identity, India's image since independence time. But today, I think there is a recovery plan has emerged. India is today clearly emerging as a significant player in the regions in trying to uphold peace and stability. Today, we don't see that kind of terrorist incident, cross-border terrorism happening in India and the neighborhood regions. India is also managing its relationship with China much smartly, in fact, quite diligently, even though there are sensitive areas to deal with. So, therefore, ontological security has emerged as a kind of, kind of frontline identical issues in Indian foreign policy. So, therefore, we could say that probably India is emerging as a significant player not only in the South Asian regions but also in the Indo-Pacific regions, trying to make a necessary revision to its identity as a peace and stable player in the South Asian region.
Right. And I suppose when we talk about, managing the regional relationships, right? And we've seen that while India has made great strides in its global diplomacy over the past few decades, emerging as an unquestionable, I'd say, global power, its regional diplomacy, it seems to have delivered mixed results at best. So, how would you evaluate India's regional strategy in terms of a cogent, cohesive strategy towards the region as compared to, say, China's? I mean, we do read a lot about China and its different activities with different countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and obviously Pakistan. How would India's regional strategy compare to China's, in particular, its approach to influence and relationship building with its immediate neighbors? And just an addendum to that, why have attempts at regional integration, I'm thinking about SARC specifically, why have they failed to achieve the success of comparable groupings like the EU or even something like ASEAN, which is in the region? Why has SARC not been able to achieve the success of those groupings?
I think this is an interesting question in the context that I think there is a lot going on in comparative perspective, particularly from China and India, when it comes to regional diplomacy. Um, but we know for a fact that regional diplomacy is an extension of global diplomacy. So both the countries, China and India, would like to always probably emphasize on regional diplomacy. That's not only, in fact, not only with the case of China and India, but the case with all the major economies in the world, be it with the US, any other major economies in the world. They would always like to emphasize a lot on regional diplomacy because it is an extension of global diplomacy. But in the context of China, I think one of the success story of China's rise has been that it has successfully implemented its diplomacy or foreign policy converse in the neighborhood regions, having a kind of moderate success in its regional diplomacy approach. For example, if we see in the post-Cold War period or at the beginning of this century, we saw China going for a small groupings called Shanghai Five groupings and turning into a effective multilateral forum in 2001 to come up with a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Shanghai Five was established in 1997-98, and that was specifically mandated to look at China's problematic boundary disputes and also the cross-border terrorism issue. But when China evolved Shanghai Five to Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it expanded the prism of Shanghai Cooperation Organization to look at trade and economy and connectivity issues, bilateral relationships. So management of relationship with the regional neighbors, particularly with the Central Asian neighbors, was a focal point in China's diplomacy. So therefore, today when we are talking about China's diplomacy, it has actually gone to the next level, relying on the immediate neighborhood or regional diplomacy. And then we saw China going for many multilateral forums in latter years. That has not really been the case of India. India probably has struggled a lot when it comes to implementing effectively its South Asian diplomacy or South Asian neighborhood diplomacy. Today we saw over the last 10 years or so, for the first time, a much more matured as well as effective South Asian policy coming up from the current government in Delhi. That is a neighborhood first policy. But before that, I think one of the problematic aspect of Indian foreign policy was that India's diplomacy towards the neighbors was not really coupled with economic diplomacy. But today, I think the last 7, 8 years or 10 years, we are seeing, even though India's neighborhood diplomacy or regional diplomacy has not really been that effective when it comes to South Asian regions particularly, still there is a mixture of both security and economic diplomacy is being employed. As a result, most of the South Asian countries, be it Nepal, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, they are still looking at India as an effective economic neighbor, economic partner in the regions as well as a neighbor. But coming back to your questions that how India has looked at the global canvas rather than the regional canvas. I think this is where we have to understand the context of India's rise as a power. And I think India's rise as a power has been much more based on a methodological planning to look at the global canvas. And this is where we have welcomed also external powers to come to our regions. And this is where we have asked in our foreign policy or promoted in our foreign policy by saying that India's foreign policy imbibes the ethos of Vasundhaya Kutumbakam. That means the whole world is one family. And we welcome the external powers to come to the local regions or to the regional, to come to the regions in South Asia, to Indo-Pacific or Indian Ocean regions, to partner with India and other countries. And this contradicts with China's analogy of Asia for Asians. As we know, President Xi Jinping, during the SICA conference in 2016, he advocated that Asia belongs to the Asians. Asia is for Asians. But that's not the way India looks at. India looks at the other, as in the other context of having a global connect and trying to involve external actors to come to the local, to the regional context to collaborate with India. And therefore, what we have seen that probably this has not really imbibed well or not really gone well with some of the smaller countries in South Asia. As a result, there has been disconsonance between the SARC members, be it Pakistan, be it Nepal or few others, they are not really gelled well with India's way of thinking. The other aspect, I think, there are too much problematic issues in South Asian regions that has not really helped the cause of SARC. For example, water as a issue. If we see, I think most of the countries in South Asia, particularly India, Bangladesh, Nepal, they are lower riparian countries. But we have a upper riparian countries like China, which acts as a water hegemon. So therefore, there are issues in the South Asian regions, particularly when it comes to water, to transboundary issues, which has not really been effectively managed by India or the South Asian countries. Hence, it reflects on the integration of SARC as a multilateral forums. But on the other hand, you took the example of EU or ASEAN. I must also bring to your attention, to your listeners here, that I think EU and ASEAN are established on different platforms. They are pan-organizational entities involved there. If we take the example of EU combines 27 countries where it is a political platform. It is purely a political platform which is trying to implement the economic ideas and economic issues in the regions, trying to establish a strategic consonance among all the countries. Similarly, if we take the example of ASEAN, it is a pan-organizational platform, a political platform which talks about economic issues. But that's not the case with SARC. SARC is a conglomeration of all the South Asian members who have disputes among themselves or discords among themselves. And there are severe territorial land borders as well as other strategic issues which does not allow them to establish a synergy, even though we could say that among the ASEAN members there is South China Sea disputes, but ASEAN prepares a context for discussion where a consensus mode discussion happens. But in the context of SARC, we have seen that none of the countries really see them as an equal within the SARC proximity, and therefore there is a problem happens. There is a problem exists between India and other South Asian member countries. But on the other hand, if we try to see in the context of China, and if we take the example of Shanghai Cooperation Organization in particular, I think the Chinese have succeeded because they have superior economic proximity with them in order to execute the connectivity issues, trying to promote the infrastructural development in the Central Asian regions. And today they have tried to merge through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization the Central Asian regions with the South Asian regions, inviting India and Pakistan to become a member. So that explains about the Chinese game plan in terms of their economic as well as strategic diplomacy in the region is concerned. I think at the bottom of all of these things, one could say that economy does matter. And unless you are really a superior economy, your canvas of playing the diplomacy is hugely limited. And this is what India is currently facing. India's economy is almost 5 times lower than the Chinese economy. Over the last 15 years, China has emerged as a stronger economy in the regions, and therefore it has successfully managed some of the multilateral institutions or forums in comparison to India. And therefore, we don't really see India succeeding so much in the neighborhood context, but succeeding probably, portraying itself as an effective power at the global platform in the Indo-Pacific regions, but not so effectively in the South Asian region.
Right. And you make a very interesting point about economic diplomacy and the size of economies as a major factor in how effective one's global diplomatic efforts might be, because we have seen that China's economic diplomacy and its investment have been one of the strongest pillars of its outreach to the global South. You see projects like the BRI and CPEC, which secure China both strategic advantages but also goodwill in South Asia and across the world. So I guess my question is, how does India compete with China then on the economic front, specifically in South Asia? And what can India offer to South Asian countries that China can't provide 5 times as much as you said? And I guess another addendum to that question is that we've seen recently let's say, the trade tensions going on in the world, and which China seems to be affected by. Do you think that the recent trade tensions between the U.S. and China in particular might increase India's attractiveness as the preferred trade partner for South Asian countries?
I think these are interesting set of questions, but let me first start with the China-India dynamics. What
Mhm.
India should do in order to, overcome this competition from China. I think competition is bound to be there, and this competition is healthy for India because we have seen that it is the economic influence and economic competition that allows often powers to improve their power base. We can take the example of China and Japan in Southeast Asia. In Southeast Asia, Japan is a bigger economic investor than China. But still, the Chinese are still trying to catch up with the Japanese. If we talk about Central Asia, Chinese competition is with Russians. Still, the Russians are trying to capture the Central Asian market and not really entirely giving it to the Chinese. So this competition exists in all of the sub-regions in the global politics. If we take the example,
Mm.
that is not really only restricted in the context of South Asia. The South Asian competition between China and India are bound to be there because both are neighbors. And let's not forget that I think China, we might not really like it, is an effective neighbor of the South Asian countries, of Pakistan, of Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and that reality cannot be changed. Geography cannot be changed. But that should not really, limit India's strategic choices. Now, here the question comes that what India should do in order to face a stronger Chinese challenge in the South Asian regions, particularly on the trade and economic dimension. I think there are three ways to deal with it. First, I think if we look at India's geography is, if we look at India's geographical map, uh, India is exposed to three parts, three sides to the sea, to the ocean sides. And I think one way of dealing with the China challenge is to empower the coastal diplomacy,
Mhm.
the maritime diplomacy and the coastal diplomacy. And if we don't do that, probably it will be too late for India to catch up with China. Because as you rightly mentioned, China's Belt and Road initiatives. China's Belt and Road initiatives has two big umbrellas, the SREB, the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the Maritime Silk Road. Through the Maritime Silk Road, China is continuously entering into the Indian Ocean regions and emerging as a stronger neighbor, stronger economic power there, trying to have not only partnerships but also emerging as a blue water navy to the deep into the Indian Ocean. And I think that aspects needs to be figured out because that involves a big amount of South Asian regions. And therefore, we need to improve our coastal developmental plans, revitalizing all of the coastal states of India. None of the coastal states of India so far are contributing in such a big way to Indian economy. And I think there is always scope of improvement, scope of bigger contribution, be it Bay of Bengal to Odisha to Andhra Pradesh to some of the southern states to Gujarat to all of these western states. I think each one of these coastal states should play a bigger role in terms of having a good trade and economic contacts with the Indian Ocean region countries. Number two, I think what we need to do also to have not only a good management of relations with South Asian countries, but also how we could partner with bigger actors with whom India could have a good synergy. For example, we could have a trilateral partnership or quadrilateral partnership with the South Asian countries. We have already trying to do the same. For example, with Japan, India is collaborating with some of the Southeast Asian countries. And that could be a base point for India to have much more trilateral partnership with external actors like South Korea, like Australia, United States of America. These are big economies in the regions. If we have a much more trilateral partnership oriented program, then it will be easier for India to manage the relationship and to also effectively stamp out its influence in with the South Asian country, and that would also you know effectively pose a serious challenge to the Chinese influence in the region. Third is, I think we have to also execute our extended neighborhood planning, um, and merge it with the immediate neighborhood planning. For example, we have an Arctist policy, but there is a gap between Arctist policy and India's first neighborhood policy. We need to really look at the Bay of Bengal regions. We need to look at BIMSTEC, all of those multilateral forums which are there. We need to focus about multilateral forums which could, bridge the gap that exists between extended neighborhood and immediate neighborhood. And if we do that, I think that too itself will provide a credible deterrence plan to the China's rising proximity in the South Asian as well as in the Indian Ocean regions. But at the same time, management of effective relationship with all the South Asian countries, be it Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, should be India's priority. And we cannot really shy away that all of these countries are cozying up to China's economic diplomacy. And therefore, India needs to look at both immediate neighborhoods as well as the extended neighborhood in order to establish this synergy to face the China competition.
Right. And I think that you made some very interesting points about, maybe leveraging trilateral and quadrilateral partnerships through external players. I do want to ask about the political aspect about this. And I'm thinking particularly about Bangladesh. We covered Bangladesh quite extensively on this podcast. And we saw that India recently suffered something of a setback in its relationship with Bangladesh. It's one of its strongest regional allies because it was perceived that India supported the ousted former leader, Sheikh Hasina. So I guess my question is, how are India and China perceived by local populations in South Asian countries? Does China also experience the same political backlash that India does in different South Asian countries? And on a broader level, to what extent do both powers interfere in domestic politics, let's say, in different countries? And do you see that, let's say, interference in domestic politics, do you see that changing in the future?
Well, I think first let me address that point about interference. We have seen that big economic actors, when they are trying to deal with some of the neighbors, they are always seen or interpreted as if they are trying to interfere in other countries' foreign policy. And this is what has been a classical argument or allegations against India, that India is trying to act as a big brother or a guardian of the South Asian regions when it comes to these smaller countries, particularly in the context of Nepal, Bangladesh, and all. But I don't think that's the case. If we see the trade and economic contacts between, Bangladesh and India in particular, Bangladesh is overtly dependent on in India on daily goods. Not only that, the people-to-people contacts, even though there is border, there is refugee problems, there is Rohingya issues, and many other neighboring border issues involving Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India we have dealt in the past. But the reality of the fact that Bangladesh is still very heavily dependent on India for its daily goods, and that Bangladesh cannot really shy away. So any country which is really dependent on a daily goods on a daily basis for the maintenance of its economy, um, it is very easy to really see in the otherwise context to say that there is an interference plan is happening. The Bangladesh context is particularly interesting because with Bangladesh, we don't have necessarily a singular problem per se. There is a range of problems which are based on day to day life of both the populations from both the countries, and also it is based on the neighborhood context. For example, there is water issues which are coming from the Himalayan valley, which is also going through India to Bangladesh. There is also a kind of migration issues, then trade and other issues. And also, most importantly, there is a historical dimension to Bangladesh issue that India faces. So, keeping all of these aspects in mind, I think India has every right and every strategic context to securitize its own relationship with Bangladesh, as well as to look at Bangladesh much more closely so that it could have a favorable regime in Bangladesh. But as you rightly pointed out, that a regime change in Bangladesh has been a huge setback for India. That's true because over the last 1 decade or so, there has been a relative stability in Bangladesh because of the previous president, Sheikh Hasina. She was quite pro-India and she saw India as a stable economic neighboring partner in the regions. And therefore, it was enough for India to look Bangladesh as a positive neighbor, as a stable neighbor in times to come. But that's not the case today. With a regime change, we see there is radical elements are emerging in Bangladesh. There are external interferences happening, particularly from China, trying to woo the current regime or the future regimes. So big economic actors like China, including the United States of America, they would like to have a regime where they could operate in the regions, particularly in South Asia to Indo-Pacific regions, sitting in Bangladesh. So therefore, there is a competition emerging between China, US, and India when it comes to Bangladesh that cannot be ruled out. But at the same time, it would be not appropriate to say that only Indian foreign policy is interfering in or appearing to emerge as a interfering foreign policy in Bangladesh. I think the Chinese foreign policy is also equally interfering, and also the foreign policies of the United States of America. Uh, Today, what we interestingly seeing that Donald Trump coming to power and trying to impose huge tariff on most of the economies in the regions. I think all of these smaller countries are going to be affected severely, and all of these smaller countries will ultimately look at China and India as their trade partner and as economic saviors. So therefore, when it comes to Bangladesh, I think there will be a realization sooner or later that Bangladesh need India, and India could be one of those stable economic partner in terms of not only for the day-to-day trade and goods, but also for bigger cultural exchanges, for knowledge dissemination, and for a much more people-to-people centric engagement. And I think one of the other drawback that India faces from Bangladesh and from the region is that probably the Bangladesh's people are very well known to the Indian, Indian people coming from the West Bengal and from the northern belt of India, northeastern belt of India. And since this familiarity in the population and their ethnic communities are there, it is easy to label this argument that India is trying to interfere in the other countries' internal affairs or domestic affairs and trying to have a say. But if you see the bigger economic actors like China and the US, their influence in Bangladesh is much, much more severe and much more higher than Indian interference in their domestic affairs. If India is trying to interfere in any way in Bangladesh today, that is to uphold peace and stability, because a stable Bangladesh not only is in the interest of India, but in the interest of the South Asian community. And therefore, we need to have a much more stable government in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, as well as a rising economy in Bangladesh, because its economy is in disarray. It doesn't have a really strong future when it comes to its economic fortune. So therefore, India would like to see probably a stronger Bangladesh rather than a unstable and struggling Bangladesh.
Right. And I think finally coming to the elephant, or rather the two elephants in the room, which are the major regional powers, China and India. Now, we're seeing a lot of geopolitical shifts ongoing right now. And while it might be a bit too soon to predict the long-term impact of the ongoing global trade turmoil, how do you think these developments might impact the China-India relationship? Now, from what we've been seeing, there does seem to be some push in China. They seem to be keen to normalize aspects of the relationship, at least on the trade side. Do you see any appetite on the Indian side for improving relations with China? How do you see the India-China relationship evolving over, let's say, the next few years of President Trump's government?
If we see India's approach to China, uh, over the last 10 years, particularly when Prime Minister Modi came to power in 2014, um, he invited Xi Jinping to visit India. Since that time, there has been always an appetite for India to improve the ties with China. So, India has always, and particularly this government in Delhi, um, has always seen China as a economic partner, as a stronger economic partner, and has seen a context where the trade and economic ties, multilateral engagement, as well as trying to have a relationship between China and India, which could reshape the global economic order in favor of the emerging economy or developing world, are always there. And therefore, we saw in lateral years, also after 2014, in 2016, India decided to establish the Asia Economic AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with China and also with Russia and few others. Um, so that the interest of the emerging economies and developing world could be catered into. And so therefore, India has always seen China positively as an economic partner, as a economic associates in the regions. And is India realizes that a stronger ties with China will always help India to create that necessary pressure zone that needs to be built in the Bretton Woods institutions, particularly in IMF, World Bank, and WTO. If you recall, I think it was the previous Indian Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh. He had continuously mentioned that India's voting voting share in IMF, World Bank, and WTO has been quite minimal. That needs to be improved. Prime Minister Modi also highlighted the same. And because of the establishment of BRICS like forum, where India and China shares the platform with many other emerging economies, because of AIB, there has been a counter pressure zone from the emerging economies. And as a result, we have seen that over the last 1 decade or so, 1.5 decades, the voting percentage of India and China in IMF, WTO, and World Bank has improved. So it has worked in favor of India. It has worked in favor of China. So what the Chinese ambassador today in Delhi is saying, that they want to see, China wants to see India positively and want to have a greater economic ties with India, is not entirely against India's interests. India has also had the similar kind of outlook towards China. But I think there are few problems which still persist. One is the trade deficit, which has been a classical problem. Probably 10 years back, it used to be half of the trade deficit. Now what it is today. Today, I think the trade deficit is touching almost 100 billion US dollar, and that's a big trade deficit because um, uh, 10 years back, the Chinese economy and Indian economy was almost the same and parallel to each other. But today, the volume of the Chinese economy has become 4 to 5 times higher than the Indian economy. So, this trade deficit will be a huge challenge to address. Unless we really address this trade deficit, we cannot have a cordial, transparent, and effective trade and economic ties between China and India. On top of this, I think what has been India's demand from China is not only to have a greater market access, but also to allow some of the premium Indian goods to be exported to China, which China does not really seems keen to import from India. And that has been a classical problem. Unless really China addresses some of these issues, I think the trade deficit is going to persist and there won't be healthy trade and economic ties between China and India. But I think the current timing of Indian Prime Minister speaking in favor of China-India relation, as well as the Chinese ambassador and Chinese leadership speaking in favor of China-India relation, is a strategic opportunity, and both the countries should take advantage of it, because there is a positive angle, positive context is emerging, particularly Trump coming back to power in the United States of America and trying to impose reciprocal tariffs, strong reciprocal tariffs. If we see fundamentally, China and India have the responsibility and oppose to all forms of unilateralism and protectionism. And to oppose all kind of unilateralism and protectionism that the Trump administration is trying to, stamp out on many of the emerging economies, China and India needs to stay together. Unless they stay together and unless they are trying to have a much more effective economic partnerships, they cannot really fight it out with US either bilaterally or in the multilateral platforms in Bretton Woods institutions, particularly in IMF, World Bank, and WTO. So therefore, we need a much more effective, good chemistry between China and India at this moment. We know that the boundary dispute is not really moving anywhere. There has been 23rd rounds of special representative dialogue has happened. Still, there is no hope that these disputes are going to be resolved anytime soon. Probably India had made it clear that unless we really solve the boundary dispute, we should not really look for a credible partnership with China on to improve the relationship with China. But I think India is willing to make this revision to its original plan. And I think even though the boundary dispute is not really entirely resolved, um, Delhi would be keen to improve the relationship with China, given the Trump administration's approach towards China and India, and also the way Americans are going to see all the emerging economies and developing world in its current foreign policy prism. And therefore, we could see that there is a bigger platform has emerged. But to what extent the Chinese leadership are reciprocating to Indian leaders, and whether Prime Minister Modi's visit to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting is going to really open any kind of leadership chemistry that has been lost between Xi Jinping and Modi for some time is getting recovered or not, that needs to be seen. But definitely, I think both the sides, particularly India, is ready to probably revisit some of its current approach to China. And we have already seen India removing some of the bans that was imposed on the Chinese companies and softwares and applications. And that's a positive indications. But a lot needs to be done. And probably this improvement should be a methodological improvement which should really put a context for a long-term, enduring and sustainable trade and economic ties between China and India. Unless that's happening, I don't think the trade deficit is going to be addressed. Unless that's happening, we can't really see China and India really trying to improve their voices in global platform and deal with American pressure the way they are facing the pressures from Trump administration currently.
Mhm. So paradoxically, President Trump's more belligerent attitude towards the emerging world might engender a detente between China and India on the conditions, obviously, that China responds to some of India's concerns and does, help take this relationship forward. But I suppose the outreach has to happen on the Chinese side as well. But yeah, Dr. Panda, that was fascinating. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much, Tushar. Lovely speaking to you and great to be here in the Diplomat platform again. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.